Tarot Historical Archetypes, The Star. Time to get to what is, in my opinion, easily the most mysterious of the major arcana cards. Its symbolism has remained a mystery for all these centuries. Now, of course, I'm not showing you the tarot card right now. I'm showing you one of a few awesome photographs I found of women at wells, drawing water from wells, that kind of a thing. Why? Because the impossible to pin down symbolism of the card seems to have something to do with the divinity of women and water, and maybe their association with water. And if you don't know anything about tarot, then this all might surprise you, given that the card is called the Star. Traditionally, in countless cultures, water, of course, was associated with life. That's why vampires can't cross running water. And I think it's safe to say traditionally as well, women were usually the ones securing and serving the water. And then take the obvious fact that new human beings, babies, only come out of women. Maybe, and I want to emphasize the maybe, this is why the woman on the traditional image of the star card, which we will get to, looks possibly pregnant and is pouring water. And all of this might be why a woman pouring water, woman/angel, a female or female divine pouring water seems to make a little bit of a motif within the major arcana, because of course it happens here in the Temperance card, not just in the Star. Here's a piece of medieval art with iconography that might remind you of the Star. It should. Let's read from a blog post entitled Watery Offerings, Women and Water in the Middle Ages. And now keep in mind, this post and the research around it has nothing to do with tarot. At the time of the blog post, the author was working on her PhD with a specialty of water and religious imagery in medieval devotional texts by and for women. And I'll be happy to leverage her expertise. She says that the association between women and water was, quote, particularly resonant in the later Middle Ages, hardwired into medieval medical and theological theories, end quote. Here's a part that's of particular interest to us from later. Quote, water transforms and can cause transformation in other objects. It twists and turns and changes directions. End quote. Now, back to my own thoughts. This idea of water being linked to transformation, I think, is easy to find in human thought. You'll have to read the blog post if you want the specifics on how in the Middle Ages it was particularly associated with women. But look at the story of Noah's Ark, which would have been well known to the creators and early users of tarot. That flood transformed the world. And what was arguably the most important ritual for the European late Middle Ages society that created tarot? Baptism. And what transforms you there? Water. Sticking to the Judeo-Christian traditions for just a moment, you remember the story of the prostitute that washed Jesus' feet with her tears, and then instead of looking down on her, he praises her and forgives her sins. Well, presumably, the Bible doesn't go into detail, but presumably she was transformed by that experience, and crying, right? You cry water, and that's transformational. By the way, in the Bible, there's also the story of Jesus meeting the woman who was drawing water at the well, an experience which transformed her. Broadening out, and this also was not something mentioned in that blog post, but I think it's safe to say, if somewhat sexist, I don't know, that women are more associated with crying or crying openly than men. So combine that and everything we've said in relation to this concept of women linked with water and water linked with transformation with what I said at the start of the video, with women obviously being linked to giving life. Speaking of not being confined to the Bible and Judeo-Christian traditions, keep in mind the story of the flood and the ark was appropriated from a Babylonian tale. And by the way, did you know that they did an exacting recreation of the ark as described in the Babylonian texts? Not fully to scale, but accurate in the construction methods. And it was led by this man here. In case you don't know who he is, you really should, because he's as close as the world has to an actual Dumbledore. And Dr. Irving Finkel, expert in Babylonian cuneiform. He has all kinds of great lectures free on YouTube. Anyway, there's also the lady in the lake in Arthurian legend. It's not the man in the lake. What else? Mermaids in folklore seem to be a much bigger deal than mermen. You also have the sirens in Greek mythology. Right, part bird, part woman, but luring sailors, right? So this is happening on the water to their doom. And then you have water nymphs. The Greeks even distinguished between the freshwater and a saltwater variety. And this idea of the female water nymph wasn't restricted to the Mediterranean either, because here's a Slavic version. And now let's get back to tarot. Here's a Marseille pattern star card, so the most continuously used throughout history. And she is pouring out water or some liquid, and it's a little hard to tell in this rendition, but like with that medieval art that we saw a minute ago, the water is kind of forming a stream or joining one and basically going out into the world. Here's a really fun take. It's based on the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, so the most popular in modernity, and just even based on that, on this one here, you can tell that the Rider-Waite-Smith hewed really close to the older template. And this helps us see an additional detail that exists in both versions, Marseille and Rider-Waite-Smith. The mysterious woman, is pouring water out onto both land and water, or on land and into water, I guess you could say, and with a foot in each. Now let's put a pin in that, though, because the other major thing we have to contend with besides women/water here is obviously the star/stars. I mean, after all, the name of the card is the star, not the woman. Now, the biggest mystery of this card is, who is this woman, or, who is she modeled on? Because as this video series focuses on, so many times we can figure out the answer even when it's a combination of pre-existing templates. I'm showing a smattering of random examples here from earlier in the Major Arcana, and that's true even whether it's a person or a scene like the Tower. But that just isn't the case with the Star card, not as far as I know and not as far as I've ever seen, in the research or literature or whatever. And so if we can't place the woman, whether she be mortal or divine, like some of the women previously in the Tarot are definitely divine, can we place the stars? Well, traditionally, we see 1 large star and 7 small stars. Now, anyone with the least familiarity with astronomy, I'm no expert, is going to instantly, I think about Aldebaran and the Pleiades. In that part of the sky, of course, you have Orion the Hunter facing off with Taurus the Bull. Aldebaran is the bull's big, bright eye. And behind him, the cluster of stars known as the Pleiades, of which 7 could usually be seen. And that cluster of 7 stars, of course there's way more if you actually go to the location, was pretty much noticed and remarked upon by, I think, every culture that ever looked up. So with 1 large star and 7 smaller ones represented on the tarot card, it's very tempting to see that as getting inspired by this part of the sky. If so, and we definitely don't know, the interesting thing there is that the Pleiades were in a lot of cultures linked to femininity. And most importantly, of course, in Greek mythology, where there's 7 sisters. They were 7 maids in Ukrainian folklore. In the northern Sahara, they called them the daughters of the night. And in Native American mythology, there's several instances where, again, they're female. Not always, which is the same thing around the rest of the world, but the Kiowa called them the 7 Star Girls. The Monte Alto culture from Central America called them the 7 Sisters. You get the point. But interesting tangent aside, does that have to do with this card? Well, it does seem to focus on femininity and stars, although originally a star, as you're going to see here in the Visconti deck, we have a woman possibly pregnant and reaching up to hold a star. So interesting that she's kind of uniting the earth and the heavens. On the heels of this start, there were variations of the star cards, some showing male astronomers, etc. Eventually, of course, that settled into the template that we've been talking about so much, which is the 1 large star with the 7 smaller ones, and the kneeling woman below pouring out the water. Even if the Pleiades have a feminine aspect, and especially in Europe of the time, which would be leveraging Greek myths, does that mean that gives us a clue as to what this card is about? Maybe. That's how mysterious this card is. Notice, by the way, that at least theoretically, you still have this concept from way back when that we saw a second ago in the Visconti card of a woman kind of uniting heaven and earth. Is she drawing power from the stars of some kind, divinity, something, and then sharing it with the earth by the pouring out of that water? That's my guess, and of course stars were very often linked with divinity in the ancient world. And notice she has 1 foot on the ground and 1 in the water, so land and sea. That at least I think we can identify in terms of source material. Some of you may be wondering, what are we looking at here? We are looking at a pretty accurate depiction of a scene from the Bible. Depending on which version of the Bible you're talking about, of course, but regardless, let's quote from one of them. Quote, I saw another powerful angel coming down out of heaven wrapped in a cloud. There was a rainbow over his head. His face was sun radiant. His legs pillars of fire. He had a small book open in his hand. He placed his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, then called out thunderously. End quote, because that's enough for our purposes. And the description of that scene, it changes from version of the Bible to version of the Bible, but the one thing that from what I can tell, is always there is the 1 foot in the sea, 1 foot in the land device. Our current image is a painting by William Blake of this scene, by the way. And anyway, what scene is it? What part of the Bible? Well, what part of the Bible do I continually say is the most important influence there is on tarot? The Book of Revelation. And that's where that quotation that I read from a moment ago is from. To go back to something I said earlier, it's almost frustrating how we just can't find a truly analogous image in medieval or Renaissance art to what we see in the final form of this card. And here's where you're just going to have to take my word for it, but this is absolutely the truth. One time, years ago, I found an image, I think it was a mosaic or something like that, or a mural from a European church with a very similar image, and the woman had 1 foot on the land, 1 foot on the water. But in all respects, minus the stars, it really looked like a precursor to the Marseille pattern. And now, no matter how much I search, I can't find it. So that's the closest one, and it's closer than anything I've seen in any article or book that's showing visual examples of what might have inspired the card. And to be clear, it's not that there must be one ancient image or specific archetype that led to what ended up on the star card. It was very likely an amalgamation, and the guessing just doesn't stop on what elements might have gone into that mix. You know, does Ishtar, later Venus, and that star play into this? Speaking of Venus, here's a depiction of her birth from the very famous Botticelli Renaissance painting, and this was made in the same century that tarot was invented. Of course, the original star card woman was modestly dressed. But that did change, and within a couple of centuries, a figure very much like this took over. And that doesn't mean that that woman is Venus or inspired by her and or that planet, slash star in the minds of the people back then. And going back for a second to the original Venus Aphrodite, which of course means Ishtar, notice what's going on. She's kind of subduing a lion. Well, that should remind us of a tarot card we dealt with earlier in this video series, right? But back to how the goddess, or whatever she is, on today's card became disrobed. Surely the Renaissance embrace of classical art, including nude figures, was the major factor in that. A question we should ask about our mystery woman is she an angel? Because we have seen what clearly seems to be an angel earlier in the sequence, and other cards with, Christian deific women, like we've talked about in videos past. And yes, they're pagan antecedents. As noted earlier in the video, one of them, the one we're looking at now, Temperance, has some serious similarities to the Star Woman. But the figures of the Temperance, Justice, and Strength cards are fully dressed. And funny enough, so are the Puppies and the Empress from earlier. So whether they're women in positions of power, one spiritual, one temporal, whether they're personified Christian virtues, like the woman, and in this case it's definitely a woman on the Strength card. So back to her. A little bit of debate about the other 2 out of 3 virtues. Regardless, the point is they're all wearing clothes, and so are all the other figures in the Major Arcana sequence so far, with the exception of the Devil card, and that makes sense. So there's a real break with the Star card, and something I've never really thought about until now making this video is it's the start of a pattern that continues in the rest of the Major Arcana sequence. But we'll get to that in our final 4 videos. Wow, I can't believe there's only 4 to go. I should have finished this video series a long time ago, but as you can see, I'm getting to it now. Speaking of the Major Arcana sequence, though, let's keep this up on screen, because the Star card represents a break not just in terms of the artistic tradition and how the woman is depicted, but obviously it starts what we could call the astronomical section as well. And this is a section of 3 cards, Star, Moon, and Sun, which are unlike anything else we've seen or will see in the sequence, right? It's about the heavens, it appears. But we will also deal with that in future videos. So, to sum up, the Star card, easily the most mysterious of the 22. What archetype or archetypes, goddess or goddesses, existing symbolic tropes or what have you did the creators use when they crafted this card in its eventual form, the one we're looking at here, which has lasted from the Marseille times all the way to today? We don't know. Not in terms of a major influence. The part about the feet being, on the land and in the water, I think that one we can trace. Anyway, there you go. Thanks for watching.